1% of reported crime was recorded. That has improved. That is what is feeding through into the increased pleaded recorded crime number. So in fact the truth is completely opposite of what he's asserting.
Very much against us, but we must hear the voice of Shipley. Mr. Philip Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Home Secretary tell us what's happened to the long-awaited and much-needed immigration bill and when it might appear before the House?
Well, I thank my friend for his question. And, of course, we will be bringing forward a white paper later this year and an immigration bill as soon as possible after that.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When will the Home Office fix a disastrous mess being caused by the Tier 2 work visa cap being exceeded 4 months in the trot? Is it not time to scrap the cap?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. He will know that we keep the Tier 2 visa route constantly under review, and we're looking very carefully at the issue he raises.
Eddie Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister reassure my constituents in Willenhall and Bloxwich that post-Brexit we will continue to work closely with our friends in Europe on matters of security and counter-terrorism?
Yes, I can certainly give him that reassurance. We know how important it is to work closely with our European Union friends on matters of security, and in my conversations with my opposite numbers, I've received much reassurance from them that that is what they want as well.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you will remember on the 29th of March, the Leader of the House said we would be having a debate in Parliament on the government's serious violence strategy when it was published. It was published on the 9th of April, so my question is quite simple. When will we be having that debate?
Well, it's a very good question, and one I will take from here to the Leader of the House. It's one I would relish, and can I also thank her for the leadership she's given in this area, and I hope to have make more progress to report on the task force in due course.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The drug commonly known as spice has as strong an impact on its users as any Class A drug does, yet its categorisation as Class B means dealers receive a much lesser sentence. Would my right honourable friend commit to re-looking at its classification and seeing whether this can be altered to more reflect the impact of this drug?
Well, I know my honourable friend has long expressed concern about the impact of spice on not least on the Torquay town centre, and I've seen at first hand the terrible effect it has. I hope he will welcome the progress we've made in relation to the Psychoactive Substances Act and the fact that over 300 retailers across the UK have either been closed down or no longer selling these substances. We are making arrests, we are making a great deal of progress, and usage is falling. In relation to changing the classification, I'm sure he will appreciate that any decision on this has to be led and guided by advice from the Advisory Council, and their position at the moment is not to reclassify. But
Tiana Berger.
My constituent Charles Mukherjee has special educational needs, and he and his family were recently detained in Yarns Wood. In detention, his medication was taken away, he had a number of seizures and stopped eating. A doctor saw him there and said he was traumatised. Will the Home Secretary urgently look at this family's experience and see what changes need to be made to ensure that we treat all people who are detained in a humane and dignified way, especially those with learning disabilities and mental ill health?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for raising that with me. Yes, I will, and I would ask her to send me the information. I will take a look at it personally.
Merriman.
Speaker, would the Home Secretary welcome the additional 200 police officers who are being recruited and deployed by Sussex Police to her constituency in Hastings, Rye, mine and Bexhill and Battle?
Yes, this is good news. The Police and Crime Commissioner for Sussex, the excellent Katie Bourne, has told us that she is going to be recruiting 200 this year and 200 the following year. Kent have said the same, and I understand there'll be another 1,000 in London.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, online radicalisation and cybercrime are no respecters of boundaries, and yet policing in Scotland has devolved. Will the Secretary of State give me an assurance that when it comes to these crimes, there's the maximum cooperation and coordination between Police Scotland and the UK police forces to stamp out these terrible and terrifying crimes?
The Honourable makes a very valid point, and that's why at Garcosh, just outside Glasgow, we have put together the National Crime Agency and Police Scotland to tackle through cybercrime units that very problem. It is absolutely true that the best thing to do is to make sure we work in solid partnership, whether it's National Crime Agency, local police, or indeed the regional organised crime units.
Mr. Speaker, has my right honourable friend made any assessment of the ease by which users can remove unacceptable online content, and then how quickly that content is taken down?
The biggest challenge in that space is often when we make a referral to the internet companies, the speed in which they take it down is not as quick as it should be. We often identify it quickly. By working with a technology company, we have managed to produce a system that's 99.95% accurate. Let's see what they can do about it, but there is still more to be done.
Mr. Speaker, fear stalks many streets in Erdington with gang crime, gun crime, knife crime, attacks with machetes on the rise. The police are doing a magnificent job in very difficult circumstances. But can I ask the Police Minister this? Does he not accept that cutting 2,000 police officers from the West Midlands Police Service, the hollowing out of neighbourhood policing and huge cuts to youth services is making it so much more difficult for them to keep the public safe?
The honourable gentleman knows I've always recognised that our police system is stretched. That's why I personally led the demand review. That's why we took through his House a funding settlement that will see another £460 million go into our police system this year. It will mean we're investing £1 billion more this year than we were 2 years ago, and that's additional money for West Midlands, which I hope he would support, but he voted against.
Mr. Clark, get in there, man.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week there were some very serious incidents of antisocial behaviour in Saltburn in my constituency. Will ministers assure the public in Saltburn that they'll work with the PCC and with me to give best advice on how to deal with youth gang violence, and will they commend the officers of Cleveland Police for their response?
Well, first of all, I am, of course, pleased to commend the officers for their response, and I'm sorry to hear of the example that's taken place. I would urge him to work with us in terms of looking at the serious violence strategy, because there is a lot of new work there and new approaches to how we're going to handle gang violence, which is often the driver not just of serious violence, but of antisocial behaviour.
Listening to colleagues is endlessly inspiring, and my appetite for doing so is usually insatiable, but we must now move on, because we have other important business to address. Order. Urgent question. Mr. David Lammy.
To ask the Home Secretary if she'll make an urgent statement on the status of Windrush children in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the honourable member for Tottenham for raising this question and giving me the chance to build on what I've already told the House this afternoon. I recognise the concern from some people in the Windrush generation, and I wouldn't want anyone who has made their life in the UK to feel unwelcome or be in any doubt of their right to remain here. As my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has already made clear, there is absolutely no question about their right to remain, and I am very sorry for any confusion or anxiety felt. While the vast majority of people who came here before 1973 will already have the documentation that proves their rights to be in the UK, I know that some do not. I know that there are those who have never applied for a passport in their own name or had their immigration status formalised. That's why today I am announcing a new dedicated team that will be set up to help these people evidence their right to be here and to access the necessary services. This team will help these applicants demonstrate they are entitled to live in the UK and will be tasked with resolving cases within 2 weeks when the evidence has been provided. Of course, no one should be left out of pocket as they go through this process, and so given the uniqueness of the situation this group find themselves in, I intend to assure that this group will not pay for this documentation. We've set up a web page and have been speaking to charities, community groups and High Commissioners about providing advice and reassurance to those affected, and we will set up a dedicated contact point as well. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister will meet the heads of government, and I will be meeting with High Commissioners this week to discuss this issue as a matter of urgency, and I hope this will provide people with the reassurance that they need.
Mr. David Lammy.
Well, can I say to the Home Secretary that the relationship between this country and the West Indies and Caribbean is inextricable. The first British ships arrived in the Caribbean in 1623, and despite slavery, despite colonisation, 25,000 Caribbeans served in the First World War and Second World War alongside British troops. When my parents and their generation arrived in this country under the Nationality Act of 1948, they arrived here as British citizens. It is inhumane and cruel for so many of that Windrush generation to have suffered so long in this condition, and for the Secretary of State only to have made a statement today on this issue? Can she explain how many have been deported? She suggested earlier that she would ask the High Commissioners. It is her department that has deported them. She should know the number. Can she tell the House how many have been detained as prisoners in their own country? Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister. Let us call it as it is. If you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. And that is what has happened with this far-right rhetoric in this country. Can she apologise properly? Can she explain how quickly this team will act to ensure that the thousands of British men and women denied their rights in this country under her watch in the Home Office are satisfied?
Mr. Speaker, I share the honourable gentleman's admiration for the people who came here from the Caribbean and contributed so much to our society in many, many different ways, and that admiration remains in place. I am concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes lose sight of the individual. And this is about individuals. And we have seen the individual stories, and they have been, some of them, terrible to hear. And that is why I have acted. That is why I have put a very clear time limit on the amount of time it will take to correct this. That is why I am so committed to ensuring that there is no cost involved. That is why I'm so committed to making sure that we can work across departments. We hope to be able to get the information that will be needed ourselves, in the same way that we're looking ahead to the EU settled status, where we will be able to engage with other departments to look at national insurance numbers. We will share, we will lead on finding the responsibility, finding the evidence, so we can get the documents for the people who need it. Finally, on one other point that he raised, I am not aware of any specific cases of a person being removed in these circumstances. That is why I have asked the High Commissioners, if they know of any, that they should bring it to me. And I would ask anybody here, if they know of any such circumstances, they should bring them to the Home Office.
Mr. Damien Green.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary is right to have set up a special unit so that the necessary reassurance can be provided as soon as possible. With that in mind, can she tell the House what's the minimum level of evidence that this new Home Office unit will accept, so that people can be able to demonstrate quickly and easily that they are genuine Windrush generation citizens of this country?
Of course, my right honourable friend, who has some experience in this matter, will be aware that we cannot have a situation where anybody can perhaps falsely declare. That will not help assist the Windrush generation, who we are trying to help. But we are going to work with them in such a way that we can work across different elements of government. So if they come to us with their address and their date of birth, we will start from that point and try and build the picture so we can evidence it, and within 2 weeks get them the permits that they need in order to be able to access the services.
Dan Abbott.
Is the Home Secretary aware that in the week of the Commonwealth Heads of Government, how shameful it appears that we are treating the Windrush generation of Commonwealth citizens in this way? As my friend, the member for Tottenham, said, they came here after the Second World War to help rebuild this country. They worked hard, they paid their taxes, and I will tell the House there are few more patriotic groups of British citizens than the generation from the West Indies that we are talking about. The Home Secretary is talking about her special team. Is Home Secretary aware that hundreds of these people have been trying to get this sorted out with their lawyers, presenting what information they have, and months later it has not been resolved? How much confidence can people have in their special team when people with lawyers have been unable to resolve their situation? Why does she not simply issue an instruction to officials that today no one can be deported who is in this position until the case is clarified. There must also be an apology to any that were wrongfully deported, and the government must consider the question of compensation. Is the Home Secretary aware that in 2014 the government removed the immigration protection that existed for Commonwealth citizens that had come here previously? Theresa May was then the Home Secretary. There was no parliamentary debate or scrutiny at the time. Theresa May could simply put down...
Order. No, focus. Order. I don't need any advice from people chuntering from a sedentary position for their own satisfaction, but to no wider benefit at all. The position is that members should not refer to other members by name. But order. I don't need... The honourable lady wittering away from a sedentary position probably feels better for doing so, but it doesn't advance the interests of the House. Diane Abbott.
I apologise for naming the former Home Secretary in this way, but it is a very serious matter that we are talking about, and I believe that the Home Secretary could now simply put down a statutory instrument restoring those protections which were removed without debate in 2014. There will be no objections from this side of the House. But finally, let me say this. This policy and this scandal did not fall from the skies. It is a product of the bent of government policy, the unquote, quote unquote, hostile environment to migrants generally. We now hear warm words about the contribution of Commonwealth migrants who've given their life to this country. But warm words are not enough. We have to establish the facts on the deportations, we have to make apologies where necessary, and we have to acknowledge when the Commonwealth heads of governments are gathered in London, what a disgrace it is that this government has treated Commonwealth migrants in this way.
Secretary.
Nobody disputes that the people who came here as part of the Windrush cohort are highly valued here and have the legal right to stay. In this week where we celebrate the Commonwealth, I would urge honourable members across both sides of the House to acknowledge the changes that we are making as a government today to ensure that this can't happen again, and so that the new processes in place will indeed reach out and protect all Commonwealth citizens who need the additional help to get their documentation in place. The Right Honourable Lady asks particularly about removals and detention, and I can reassure her and the House that I have given that instruction. In accordance with my wishes today, there will be no removals or detention as part of any assistance to help former Commonwealth citizens get their proper documentation in place.
Mark Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome what the Home Secretary set out today, and also the detail that was given by the Immigration Minister in her media interviews today, and also the calm and measured tone in which he set it out. Given that many of the people in this position won't be aware that they're in this position until they run into difficulties, can she say any more about what steps the government could take proactively to communicate what it's doing to some of those who might be affected, so they're never actually put in this position in the first place and can have their status regularised?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and he's right. I really do want people who are in this position to realise that we have made the changes, we have set up a system which will be easy to use and accommodating to them. There will be no charge for it, and I would urge honourable members across the House to pass that on to their constituents so that people have the confidence to approach us so it can be addressed. But of course the Home Office will be doing its own media to ensure that that is the case.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the honourable member for Tottenham in securing this urgent question and tell him that the Scottish National Party share his outrage on behalf of the Windrush generation and how some of these now quite elderly people have been treated by the Home Office. Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary is wrong. This isn't just about individuals. It's about a systemic policy put out by her department, and it is symptomatic of the politically driven, hostile environment policy. And it's a sign that it has to stop. And I hope in what she said this afternoon, there's a vague chink of optimism that she is going to review this hostile environment policy. Now, Mr Speaker, I saw in the Mall this morning all the flags out for the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference, but all the government's warm words about the Commonwealth will be seen as weasel words unless they take proper steps to address what's happening to these people who are as much part of our country as the Home Secretary and myself. Now, I've heard what she has to say about the procedures she's putting in place, but the Migration Observatory at Oxford University say there's up to 50,000 Commonwealth-born people in this situation. What's she going to do to recognise the almost impossible nature of the task they face in evidencing their right to be here? And is she going to give them access to legal advice to help them to combat the Home Office's often unfair procedures?
The Home Secretary.
Well, the Right Honourable Lady Learner Friend has raised a number of important points. I would just say that it is right that we have a policy that distinguishes between legal and illegal migrants, and the Commonwealth group, the so-called Windrush cohort, are legal. And that is why I've put in place these measures in order to protect them. I think that is a clear difference between other groups to whom we have a compliant environment to ensure that people who are here legally are looked after, but people who are here illegally should not be here, and we have the information that we can collect to lawfully and correctly remove them.
Sir Roger Gale.
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend's assurance that the costs will be borne by the state will be most welcome. It's clear that that may have acted as a deterrent to some in the past when seeking to regularise their position. My right honourable friend make absolutely certain that it's made very clear, very publicly, that there is no need to go and hire an expensive lawyer to put this right. We can do it.
Well, the very important point for my honourable friend is that the system that I will now put in place will not require people to go to their lawyers. I hope it will be sufficiently constructive, sympathetic and helpful that it will not require people who are seeking to regularise their position to have lawyers.
Yvette Cooper.
The Home Office has been warned repeatedly about failings in its decision-making processes and weaknesses in the hostile environment operation. And her response to this problem now is far too passive, just a task force that relies on the Windrush generation raising their problems with her. That's not good enough. She should now be instituting a huge review right across the Home Office of all of the cases of the Windrush generation, not just suspending deportations and detention, but also working urgently with the DWP and the NHS to make sure that nobody from that generation loses their benefits, their homes or their healthcare while this is being sorted out.
Well, I would respectfully say to the Right Honourable Lady, who usually has such careful knowledge on this area, that it is of course the case that we do not have individual numbers for the Windrush generation because they are not identified as such when they come here. And when the Right Honourable and Learned Lady referred to the assessment of 50,000, we don't know whether that's the case because we don't have identification cards obviously in this country, so we don't know. We don't know until people approach us. The point that I am trying to convey here, and I hope will go out from this House, is that anybody who would like to have their system regularised, we will help, we will assist, and there will be no cost to it.
Order. There's intense interest in this matter, and that is to be expected. Interest I'm keen as far as possible to accommodate, but I remind the House that there is important business to which we must proceed. Therefore, there is a premium on brevity from back and front benches alike. Put bluntly, if people ask long questions, they will do so knowing that they're stopping other colleagues contributing, and that's not something they'd want to do, I feel sure. Mr. Nigel Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was sickened to read these stories myself, and I'm reassured by what she's had to say today. But will she ask her officials to review all cases where it is a possibility that the Windrush generation have been deported? Will she ask them to look at all those cases now?
Well, as I have said earlier, I do not have any evidence that anybody has been removed in that way, but I have invited anybody who knows. Some people are talking about as though it has taken place. It has been suggested in some media companies that has taken place, and I would therefore invite people who have any such evidence to bring it to the Home Office so we can take a look.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Home Secretary that the way this trailblazing generation and their families have been treated in this
year, the 70th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush on our shores, is a complete and utter disgrace. Yeah. So many are my constituents. She's talked about individual cases. One has been very well publicised. He hasn't been able to get access to cancer treatment that he needs from the NHS because of his immigration status. Now, she has said these will be processed quickly. OK, that is welcome. She says her department will help individuals in this situation to identify the evidence. What if the evidence doesn't exist? And with regard to healthcare, will she commit to ensuring that indefinite leave to remain is granted?
The Home Secretary, we're immensely grateful. We've got a lot to get through. It's very self-indulgent if people spend ages. I understand the importance, but colleagues have got to do it pithily. It's as simple as that. Home Secretary.
I completely understand the urgency of getting this addressed so that people can have access to the NHS when they need it, and I'm going to make sure that we do it in such a speedy manner that that will address the particular need that people have. It shouldn't interfere with their treatment. The fact is, as we know, the hospitals are increasingly asking for evidence of residence. We will help them get the evidence. My honourable friend has asked for this. There is always going to be evidence of people living in a country, and my task force will make sure that we find it so that we can get it to them.
Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, we owe a debt of gratitude to the Windrush generation for coming to the aid of this country. Will my right honourable friend enable all of us as MPs to have access to an appropriate means of communicating cases that come to us so they are dealt with quickly, speedily and in the way that we want to see people thanked for their service?
Yes, I think that's a very good point from my honourable friend. I will ensure that everybody in the House has the details of the contact point in the task force, and also that we are able to communicate to everybody who's assisted this country, the people from the Windrush generation, our thanks and support.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assurances will the Home Secretary give to people who settle from other parts of the Commonwealth other than the West Indies, including many from Bangladesh and Pakistan in my constituency? And will she commit to my honourable friend's suggestion about a statutory instrument to restore the protections to the Commonwealth countries?
The Home Secretary.
I think I will have to respectfully come back to the honourable lady on that point in terms of the statutory instrument. My purpose here today is really to reassure on this particular cohort and to make sure that we have the right systems in place to act swiftly and efficiently as they would expect.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Home Secretary's absolute clarity that the Windrush generation's right to remain here is unchallenged, and we as constituency MPs want to do all we can to help them. So could she confirm that there will be an MP's hotline through which we can help our constituents most unable to help themselves?
Yes, I am aware, of course, as members of Parliament, as leaders in their own areas, will need to be able to access that hotline, need to be able to access all the information so that we can act fairly, efficiently and effectively with the Windrush generation who are so valued in this country.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of my constituents have been caught up in the government's hostile environment policy, including one of my constituents, Paul, who has been here for 4 decades. He was removed from his home and detained at one of the Croydon detention centres. So my question is, again, to the Home Secretary, can she commit to introducing a statutory instrument that would actually reverse and restore those rights that the Windrush generation were secured?
Well, unfortunately, I can't comment on individual cases in this chamber, but if the honourable lady would like to write to the Home Office or bring the particular case that she has, then I will make sure that it's looked at.
Simon Hall.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome what my right honourable friend has said, but urge her to give consideration that where applicants are ultimately proved to be successful, if they have already incurred legal fees trying to make their case, those fees could be compensated.
Secretary.
Well, I'm happy to take that away and come back to him on it, but what I really hope is that going forward, it is my strong commitment to ensure that the system that we put in place will not require legal advice. It will be straightforward, effective to use, and my team in the task force will work with individuals to deliver that.
Bambos Charalambos.
I wrote to the Home Secretary about my constituent Bill Samuel, who came to the UK as a 6-year-old from St Vincent's with his grandmother back in the 60s. He's worked and paid taxes since 1973. He was told by the Home Office that he'd have to pay £237 to apply for a no time limit status. Can the Home Secretary confirm that he won't need to pay this amount of money or apply for no time limit status in order to apply for a British passport?
Secretary.
Well, I can confirm that we are not going to be charging for that no time limit status that the honourable gentleman is referring to in his question. In terms of the individual journey to a passport, I'm afraid we will have to take that away, and we'll have to look at the individual case.
Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, I commend the Home Secretary for her statement. I would say to her, it's not just the Windrush generation, it is across all of those. Certainly in my experience as a Member of Parliament, her officials unfortunately have a default position, it seems, of no. Would she agree with me, however, that it's at moments like this that we, on both sides of this House, need to accept the need for a proper debate about immigration, an open and honest debate about immigration, and if we did that, we might come to the proper conclusion that it's not just the Windrush generation, but it's generations over centuries of immigrants that have contributed in a positive way to all aspects of life in our country.
Well, I thank my right friend who makes a powerful point about the value of immigration in this country. And in terms of her approach to the Home Office, I share the approach that I need to ensure that the Home Office is more focused on individuals than it is on policy, so that individuals do not receive the type of treatment that we have seen over the past few weeks, but instead have a Home Office that leans in and tries to assist.
Sir Edward Davey.
Will the Home Secretary clarify definitively, will this new dedicated team helping the Windrush generation be accessible to all Commonwealth citizens facing similar problems?
Secretary.
Yes, we will make sure that they can assist others as well.
Mr. Speaker, on that note, I very much welcome the government's assurances today to help these Commonwealth citizens, but I particularly wanted to cite a constituent of mine from Uganda who came here thrown out by Idi Amin. Will these new systems put in place help this constituent who's lived in my constituency for 40 years, and he has had a heart-rending experience with people wanting to throw him out?
Well, I'm sorry that the Honourable Lady's constituent is having such a challenging time, and I would urge her to contact the Immigration Minister to take a look at his particular case.
Seema Malhotra.
Speaker, following her statement, could the Home Secretary clarify that her department is still seeking people to prove their rights, whilst they have no recourse to public funds and no right to work? What is her message to those that may need legal advice but cannot afford it?
Secretary.
Well, it is my firm belief that the individuals who will be able to access this group in the Home Office will not need legal advice, because it will be a simple process, and it'll be one where my team will try to assist. We will be able to use information across government, so we will be able to help prove their national insurance number or their school records without calling on them to send in so much. It will be a shared responsibility, which I think will make a big difference.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for her clear message today that not only are the Windrush generation have the legal right to stay, but they are welcome and that we want them to stay where that is their desire. And will she provide reassurance that her department will be providing every sensitive assistance possible to help people affected by this produce the documentation that they
Well, I thank my honourable friend for giving me the opportunity to reinforce that point. We value immigrants in this country. We value the contribution that the Windrush community have made, and I will ensure going forward that that value is conveyed to them.
Karen Buck.
The Home Secretary aware that there is real fear spreading through some of our diverse communities, and one of the impacts of that is that people who are entirely legitimately entitled to make use of public services are being deterred from doing so. Will she be speaking to other departmental heads in order to make sure the message goes out, particularly in respect to the health service, that nobody avoids accessing services because they are frightened of what the hostile environment is going to do?
Well, of course, I don't want people who have health issues not to be able to contact the National Health Service. And one of the saddest things of some of these stories that we have heard has been about people not being able to do that. And that is one of the reasons why I feel so much urgency about addressing this, so that happens to less people.
Julian Knight.
Speaker, I welcome our Right Honourable's announcements of a special task force. Can she confirm precisely how quickly will cases be processed? and crucially, when she envisages the backlog of cases will ultimately be dealt with as people need this shadow removed from their lives.
Secretary.
Well, I think the most important thing we can convey from today's statement is that the Home Office is going out of its way to ensure that we can reassure people that they will be able to get that information. I don't expect that there to be a great rush of people who will want to apply, but whenever people need to, I will ensure that that process is done quickly, effectively and efficiently.
Order. I understand the sense of anticipation in the Chamber about subsequent business, but I would just gently point out that we are discussing the rights and the futures of residents of this country. This is an extremely serious matter, and the issue and the people speaking about it should be treated with respect. It really shouldn't be necessary to say that again. Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the key point in all of this that the pernicious hostile environment impacts on everybody, whether they're here legally or otherwise? You can hardly get out your bed these days without somebody asking to see your passport. Isn't it time to scrap the hostile environment?
Secretary.
I simply don't accept the Honourable Gentleman's interpretation. It is not correct that you have to show your passport at every step. I do think it's important to make a clear distinction between people who are here legally and people who are here illegally. But the point about today's statement is that the people who came with the Windrush group are here legally, and we will look after them.
Khalid Mahmood.
I thank my honourable friend from Tottenham for his work and leadership on this issue. This decision today will cost my constituents and all the people of the Windrush generation huge amounts of money in legal costs to do that. Will she look to set up a unit within the Home Office to deal with them and refer them back to members of Parliament to deal with it?
Well, I would say to the Honourable Gentleman that we are setting up this team of about 20 people who will be able to engage with the generation who need to have their situation regularised. I hope that they won't need legal advice. Of course, if that is the case, he makes a fair point. I will take a look at whether we need to assist with that.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend outline what engagement she'll have with charities and community groups to ensure people do not need to go to expensive lawyers to find out about the new procedures she's outlined today?
Well, I share my honourable friend's view about expensive lawyers. We have begun engagement with charities, NGOs, and of course the High Commissioners who have been in touch with us, and I will make sure that we have a thorough public engagement to ensure that people are aware of the process that we've set up and that it will not cost them money.
Richard Burden.
I emphasise to the Home Secretary that some of the problems faced by the Windrush generation go well beyond people who came here from the Caribbean. By way of example, can I tell her about a constituent of mine who was born in a Commonwealth country to Polish refugees from Nazism, who has lived in this country since 1951 and who has served in the Grenadier Guards and who was turned down for a UK passport? Will people in his situation be subject to the fast-track procedure that the Home Secretary outlined today?
I would fully expect them to be subject to that, and I find the Honourable Gentleman's statement very surprising, so I'd ask him to write to me about it. The default position of the team that I am setting up will be to get the information and to accept people. The only situation where they wouldn't be accepted is on serious criminality.
Tom Burstglove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the sentiment expressed by my right honourable friend, and those affected may well approach local advice services such as the Citizens Advice Bureau in our constituencies seeking support. So will she undertake to disseminate comprehensive guidance to them ASAP?
I thank my honourable friend for a helpful suggestion. That is an organisation, of course, that I will engage with as well to ensure that they have the information. But I would also urge members of Parliament to tell their constituents about the positive arrangements that this government has now put in place so that the people from that cohort can be looked after and can stop fearing for their situation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would be grateful, Mr. Speaker, if the Home Secretary would tell me how I should explain to the elders of the Afro-Caribbean community in my constituency in Bristol West why they are being expected to prove that they have a right to be in the country to which they have paid taxes and national insurance and contributed so much, rather than the other onus being the other way round on the Home Office to prove that they don't.
Secretary.
I say to the Honourable Lady that the dedicated team that I am setting up will work with the individuals from her community to ensure that we will look for the information which they will engage with us on. We cannot look in isolation if people don't engage with us and don't give us the information that we need. But we are going to work across government to ensure that where there's a national insurance number or where there's a school, that we try and get that information. Please tell her community that the Home Office is here to help them.
Nasha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Home Secretary could answer my question whether there was previously an exemption for leave to remain for both citizens, Commonwealth citizens that arrived in the UK before 1973. Can she also confirm if and when this was removed from the legislation, and if so, when this was debated by Parliament?
Home Secretary.
What the Honourable Lady's constituents really want to know is whether they have a legal right to be here. And the purpose of me standing here today is to confirm to them and to all members here they do have the legal right. We want them to take it up if that is what they want. And my unit in the Home Office will be leaning in to make sure that we make that as simple and as effective as possible.
Helen Hayes.
For Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton, where many Windrush passengers came to look for work and make their homes. I can tell the Home Secretary that it is entirely wrong for her to present this as a new problem which has suddenly arisen. It has been going on for years, and it is a consequence of government policy which lacks any grace or compassion, and which in its intolerance looks for any possible reason why people who have come here from overseas should not be allowed to stay. Will the Home Secretary now commit to look at the systemic problems with UK VI and reform the immigration system so that people who have made their lives in this country and contributed so much can live with security and dignity in their old age?
That's exactly what I want this country to look like. The sort of country where her constituents can have confidence here. I would point out to the Honourable Lady that it was, of course, Labour who introduced the labour market test so that people had to evidence their status in 2008. So this hasn't started entirely with us. But if we want to live in a country where there is a difference between legal and illegal residents here, then it is absolutely right to have a system which addresses that.
Mr. David Linden.
Mr. Speaker, if the Secretary of State is saying that there's no way of checking whether or not someone's been wrongly deported, does that mean it's the same for asylum seekers as well?
Mr. Speaker, I only heard part of the Honourable Gentleman's question, but I can tell him that I do not know of any cases where people have been removed, but I have said to members here, as I've said to the High Commissioners, if they know of any cases, they should bring them to us.
Emma Reynolds.
Speaker, my constituent Paulette Wilson came here from Jamaica in 1968, aged 10. She worked in the UK all her life, including here in Parliament. Last October she was detained at Yarlswood and threatened with being deported. The Home Secretary says she doesn't know the extent of this problem or the numbers, but surely a simple search by date of birth and origin would give her that data. Will she go away and have a look at that?
Well, if the Honourable Lady wants to write to me with a particular case, I will certainly look at it. But I would say that I have put out an instruction today that there will be no detention or removal of anybody in this cohort who makes any questions. So I have removed that fear, but I'm much more ambitious than that. I want to make sure that our new dedicated unit really addresses this and sorts out, to the satisfaction of everybody involved, the individual status of the people who have come here and contributed so much.
Mrs. Louise Ellman.
Will the Home Secretary instruct the Home Office to be supportive to individuals who apply under this scheme, rather than leave already traumatised individuals having to meet very, very difficult requirements when they are already in such distress?
Yes, the default position will be to accept. The only real change to that will be if there is serious criminality. We will need to work with the individuals to ensure that the information is collected, but I want to make sure this works for the individuals. As I said earlier, this is about individuals whose lives have been upset, who need the reassurance. I want to make sure that they get it.
Finally, Jess Phillips.
Thank
Mr. Speaker. I often want to offer the members opposite who maybe don't understand what it's like to work with the Home Office every single day, if they would like to come and work in my constituency office, so I put that offer out there. Can I ask, as somebody who works with them every single day, how many people will be in this team? And how long will this team last for? Because this is not a problem that is going to go away overnight.
Home Secretary.
I work with the Home Office every day, I would say to the Honourable Lady, and I am aware of some of the challenges. The team will have 20 people in it. It will deliver what I have set out to say today, and we will see how long it is needed. What I'm interested in is outcomes, effective, sympathetic outcomes for the people who need it, who are so valued by this country.
Thank you. Order. Statement of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, before I come to the substance of my statement, I am sure the whole House will wish to join me in offering our heartfelt condolences to the family and friends of Sergeant Matt Tonrow from the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, who was killed by an improvised explosive device on the 29th of March. Sergeant Tonrow was embedded with US forces on a counter-Daesh operation. He served his country with great distinction, and it is clear he was a gifted and intelligent instructor who was respected by everyone he served with. Sergeant Tonrow fought to protect British values, our freedoms, and to keep this country safe. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the actions that we have taken, together with our American and French allies, to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capabilities and to deter their future use. On Saturday, the 7th of April, up to 75 people, including young children, were killed in a horrific attack in Douma, with as many as 500 further casualties. All indications are that this was a chemical weapons attack. UK medical and scientific experts have analysed open source reports, images and video footage from the incident and concluded that the victims were exposed to a toxic chemical. This is corroborated by first-hand accounts from NGOs and aid workers. While the World Health Organization received reports that hundreds of patients arrived at Syrian health facilities on Saturday night with signs and symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals. And based on our assessment, we do not think that these reports could be falsified on this scale. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the Syrian regime has reportedly been attempting to conceal the evidence by searching evacuees from Douma to ensure samples are not being smuggled from this area. And a wider operation to conceal the facts of the attack is underway, supported by the Russians. Mr. Speaker, the images of this suffering are utterly haunting. Innocent families, seeking shelter in underground bunkers, found dead with foam in their mouths, burns to their eyes, and their bodies surrounded by a chlorine-like odour. Children gasping for life as chemicals choked their lungs. The fact that such an atrocity can take place in our world today is a stain on our humanity. And we are clear about who is responsible. A significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for this latest attack. Open source accounts state that barrel bombs were used to deliver the chemicals. Barrel bombs are usually delivered by helicopters. Multiple open source reports and intelligence indicates that regime helicopters operated over Douma on the evening of the 7th of April, shortly before reports emerged in social media of a chemical attack. And the Syrian military officials coordinated what appears to be the use of chlorine weapons. Mr. Speaker, no other group could have carried out this attack. The opposition does not operate helicopters or use barrel bombs. Daesh does not even have a presence in Douma. And the reports of this attack are consistent with previous regime attacks. These include the attack on the 21st of August 2013, where over 800 people were killed and thousands more injured in a chemical attack also in Ghouta. 14 further smaller-scale chemical attacks reported prior to that summer. 3 further chlorine attacks in 2014 and 2015, which the independent UNSC-mandated investigation attributed to the regime. And the attack at Khan Sheikhoun on the 4th of April last year, where the Syrian regime used sarin against its people, killing around 100 with a further 500 casualties. Based on the regime's persistent pattern of behaviour and the cumulative analysis of specific incidents, we judged it highly likely that the Syrian regime had continued to use chemical weapons on at least 4 occasions since the attack in Khan Sheikhoun, and we judged that they would have continued to do so. So we needed to intervene rapidly to alleviate further indiscriminate humanitarian suffering. Mr. Speaker, we've explored every possible diplomatic channel to do so, but our efforts have been repeatedly thwarted. Following the sarin attack in eastern Damascus back in August 2013, the Syrian regime committed to dismantle its chemical weapon program, and Russia promised to ensure that Syria did this, overseen by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. At the weekend, the Leader of the Opposition cited this diplomatic agreement as a precedent that this process can work. But this process did not work. It did not eradicate the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime, with only last month the Opcw finding that Syria's declaration of its former chemical weapons programme is incomplete. And as I've already set out, it did not stop the Syrian regime from carrying out the most abhorrent atrocities using these weapons. Furthermore, on each occasion when we have seen every sign of chemical weapons being used, Russia has blocked any attempt to hold the perpetrators to account at the UN Security Council, with 6 such vetoes since the start of 2017. And just last week, Russia blocked a UN resolution that would have established an independent investigation able to determine responsibility for this latest attack. So regrettably, we had no choice but to conclude that diplomatic action on its own is not going to work. The Leader of the Opposition has said that he can only countenance involvement in Syria if there is UN authority behind it. The House should be clear. That would mean a Russian veto on our foreign policy. When the Cabinet met on Thursday, we considered the advice of the Attorney General. Based on this advice, we agreed that it was not just morally right, but also legally right to take military action, together with our closest allies, to alleviate further humanitarian suffering. This was not about intervening in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. It was about a limited, targeted and effective strike that sought to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring their use. And we have published the legal basis for this action. It required 3 conditions to be met. First, there must be convincing evidence generally accepted by the international community as a whole of extreme humanitarian distress on a large scale, requiring immediate and urgent relief. Second, it must be objectively clear that there is no practicable alternative to the use of force if lives are to be saved. And third, the proposed use of force must be necessary and proportionate to the aim of relief of humanitarian suffering and must be strictly limited in time and in scope to this aim. These are the same 3 criteria used as the legal justification for the UK's role in the NATO intervention in Kosovo. Our intervention in 1991 with the US and France, and in 1992 with the US, to create safe havens and enforce the no-fly zones in Iraq following the Gulf War, were also justified on the basis of humanitarian intervention. So governments of all colours have long considered that military action on an exceptional basis, where necessary and proportionate, and as a last resort to avert an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe, is permissible under international law. Mr. Speaker, I've set out why we are convinced by the evidence and why there was no practicable alternative. Let me set out how this military response was also proportionate. This was a limited, targeted and effective strike that would significantly degrade Syrian chemical weapons capabilities and deter their future use, and with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. As a result, the coordinated actions of the US, UK and France were successfully and specifically targeted at 3 sites. Contrary to what the Leader of the Opposition said at the weekend, these were not empty buildings. The first was the Baza branch of the Scientific Studies and Research Centre in northern Damascus. This was a centre for the research and development of Syria's chemical and biological programme. It was hit by 57 American TLAMs and 19 American JASSMs. The second site was the Him Shinzar chemical weapons bunkers, 15 miles west of the city of Homs, which contained both a chemical weapons equipment and storage facility and an important command post. These were successfully hit by 7 French Scalp cruise missiles. And the third site was the Him Shinzar chemical weapons storage site and former missile base, which is now a military facility. This was assessed to be a location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment, whose destruction would degrade Syria's ability to deliver sarin in the future. This was hit by 9 US TLAMs, 5 naval and 2 Scalp cruise missiles from France, and 8 Storm Shadow missiles launched by R4 RAF Tornado GR4s. Very careful scientific analysis was used to determine where best to target these missiles to maximise the destruction of stockpiled chemicals and to minimise any risk to the surrounding area. And the facility that we targeted is located some distance from any known population centres, reducing yet further any such risk of civilian casualties. Mr. Speaker, while targeted and limited, these strikes by the US, UK and France were significantly larger than the US action a year ago after the attack at Khan Sheikhoun, and specifically designed to have a greater impact on the regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons. We also minimise the chances of wider escalation through our carefully targeted approach, and the House will note that Russia has not reported any losses of personnel or equipment as a result of these strikes. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in paying tribute to all the British servicemen and women and their American and French allies who successfully carried out this mission with such courage and professionalism. Mr. Speaker, let me deal specifically with 3 important questions. First, why did we not wait for the investigation from the OPCW? UNSC mandated inspectors have investigated previous attacks and on 4 occasions decided that the regime was indeed responsible. We are confident in our own assessment that the Syrian regime was highly likely responsible for this attack and that its persistent pattern of behaviour meant that it was highly likely to continue using chemical weapons. Furthermore, there were clearly attempts to block any proper investigation, as we saw with the Russian veto at the UN earlier in the week. And let me set this out in detail. We support strongly the work of the OPCW fact-finding mission that is currently in Damascus. But that mission is only able to make an assessment of whether chemical weapons were used. Even if the OPCW team is able to visit Duma to gather information to make that assessment, and they are currently being prevented from doing so by the regime and the Russians, it cannot attribute responsibility. This is because Russia vetoed in November 2017 an extension of the joint investigatory mechanism set up to do this. And last week, in the wake of the Duma attack, it again vetoed a new UNSC resolution to re-establish such a mechanism. And even if we had OPCW's findings and a mechanism to attribute, for as long as Russia continues to veto, the UN Security Council still would not be able to act. So, Mr. Speaker, we cannot wait to alleviate further humanitarian suffering caused by chemical weapons attacks. Second, were we not just following orders from America? Let me be absolutely clear. We have acted because it is in our national interest to do so. It is in our national interest to prevent the further use of chemical weapons in Syria and to uphold and defend the global consensus that these weapons should not be used. For we cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, either within Syria, on the streets of the UK or elsewhere. So we have not done this because President Trump asked us to do so. We have done it because we believed it was the right thing to do, and we are not alone. There is broad-based international support for the action we've taken. NATO has issued a statement setting out its support, as have the Gulf Cooperation Council and a number of countries in the region. And over the weekend, I have spoken to a range of world leaders, including Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Gentiloni, Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Turnbull, and European Union Council President Donald Tusk. All have expressed their support for the actions that Britain, France, and America have taken. Third, why did we not recall Parliament? Mr. Speaker, the speed with which we acted was essential in cooperating with our partners to alleviate further humanitarian suffering and to maintain the vital security of our operations. This was a limited, targeted strike on a legal basis that has been used before, and it was a decision which required the evaluation of intelligence and information much of which was of a nature that could not be shared with Parliament. We have always been clear that the government has the right to act quickly in the national interest. I am absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, that it is Parliament's responsibility to hold me to account for such decisions, and Parliament will do so. But it is my responsibility as Prime Minister to make these decisions, and I will make them. Mr. Speaker, as I have been clear, this military action was not about intervening in the civil war in Syria or about regime change. But we are determined to do our utmost to help resolve the conflict in Syria. That means concluding the fight against Daesh, which still holds pockets of territory in Syria. It means working to enable humanitarian access and continuing our efforts at the forefront of global response, where the UK has already committed almost £2.5 billion, our largest ever response to a single humanitarian crisis. And next week we will attend the second Brussels conference on supporting the future of Syria and the region, which will focus on humanitarian support, bolstering the UN-led political process in Geneva, and ensuring continued international support to refugees and host countries, driving forward the legacy of our own London conference held in 2016. And it means supporting international efforts to reinvigorate the process to deliver a political solution, for this is the best long-term hope for the Syrian people. The UK will do all of these things, but as I've also been clear, that is not what these military strikes were about. Mr. Speaker, as I've set out, the military action that we have taken this weekend was specifically focused on degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring their future use. In order to achieve this, there must also be a wider diplomatic effort, including the full range of political and economic levers, to strengthen the global norms prohibiting the use of chemical weapons, which have stood for nearly a century. So we will continue to work with our international partners on tough economic action against those involved with the production or dissemination of chemical weapons. And I welcome the conclusion of today's European Foreign Affairs Council, attended by my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, that confirmed the Council is willing to consider further restrictive measures on those involved in the development and use of chemical weapons in Syria. We will continue to push for the re-establishment of an international investigative mechanism which can attribute responsibility for chemical weapon use in Syria. We will advance with our French allies the new international partnership against impunity for the use of chemical weapons, which will meet in the coming weeks. And we will continue to strengthen the international coalition we have built since the attack on Salisbury. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday's report from the Opcw has confirmed our findings that it was indeed a Novichok in Salisbury, and I've placed a copy of that report's executive summary in the Library of the House. While of a much lower order of magnitude, the use of a nerve agent on the streets of Salisbury is part of a pattern of disregard for the global norms that prohibit the use of chemical weapons. So while the action was taken to alleviate humanitarian suffering in Syria by degrading the regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring its use of these weapons, it will also send a clear message to anyone who believes they can use chemical weapons with impunity. We cannot go back to a world where the use of chemical weapons becomes normalised. Mr. Speaker, I'm deeply conscious of the gravity of these decisions. They affect all members of this House and me personally. And I understand the questions that rightly will be asked about British military action, particularly in such a complex region. But I am clear that the way we protect our national interest is to stand up for the global rules and standards that keep us safe. That is what we have done and what we will continue to do, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.